The fluorescent lights of the emergency room cast everything in harsh relief at 2 in the morning, and I was elbow deep in my third trauma case of the night when the doors burst open and the temperature of the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. I looked up from the medication chart I was reviewing to see 4 men carrying a fifth between them, and I knew immediately these were not ordinary patients seeking help. The man they carried was bleeding heavily from his abdomen, his face gray with blood loss, but it was the others who made my pulse spike with a primal warning. They moved with predatory coordination, their eyes scanning the room for threats, hands hovering near their jackets in a way that made my stomach clench. The largest one barked at my nurse to get me now, and I was already moving forward, my training overriding my fear. Calling for a gurney and rattling off orders. They laid him down with surprising gentleness, and I cut away his shirt to reveal the gunshot wound, through and through, and started my assessment. That was when I felt it, the weight of a gaze so intense it was nearly physical. I glanced up and met the coldest gray eyes I had ever seen. The man stood apart from the others, utterly still in the chaos, watching me with the focused attention of a predator assessing prey. He was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a black suit that probably cost more than my monthly rent, and there was something about him that screamed danger and control and barely leashed violence. I forced myself to look away and focus on my patient, calling for blood, for the OR to be prepped, working quickly to stabilize the bleeding. My hands were steady even though I could feel those gray eyes tracking my every movement, cataloging every decision, and it made my skin prickle with awareness. The wounded man was young, maybe 25, and he kept trying to speak, but I told him to save his strength. When security finally noticed the armed men in the ER and tried to approach, 2 of them simply shifted position, and the security guards stopped, clearly outmatched and uncertain. I wanted to tell everyone to leave, to call the police, but my patient was crashing and nothing mattered except keeping him alive. 20 minutes later, I had him stabilized enough for transport to surgery, and as they wheeled him away, I stripped off my bloody gloves and took my first full breath. That was when the man with the gray eyes moved. He crossed the space between us in 3 long strides, stepping far too close, invading my personal space with the casual entitlement of someone who had never been told no. Up close, he was even more overwhelming, at least 6 inches taller than me, smelling of expensive cologne and something darker. And when he spoke, his voice was low and smooth and absolutely glacial. He thanked me for saving his man, but it did not sound like gratitude. It sounded like I had passed some kind of test I had not known I was taking. He asked my name. I hesitated, some instinct telling me that giving it would change something fundamental, but my ID badge was visible and lying seemed more dangerous than truth. Eleanor Ashford, I told him. He repeated it slowly, as if tasting each syllable, and then smiled without warmth. When security tried again to intervene, asking if I was all right, his men moved to block them, and the man himself never looked away from my face. I stood my ground despite my racing heart, meeting those cold eyes, and told him I needed to get back to work. He studied me for another endless moment, then stepped back and turned to leave. But at the door he glanced back over his shoulder, and the expression on his face was something I could not read. Assessment, recognition, something that made my blood run cold and hot at the same time. Then he was gone, and I was left standing in the fluorescent brightness surrounded by the aftermath of violence, my hands trembling now that the adrenaline was fading, knowing with absolute certainty that my life had just shifted on its axis in a direction I could not predict or control. Now please take a moment and subscribe to our channel and comment where you are watching from and what time is it. It is always fascinating to see where these stories get all around the world. Thank you. I could not shake the memory of those gray eyes all through the next day, could not focus during rounds, my attending asking me twice if I was all right, and I lied and said I was just tired. The truth was, I felt exposed, like something predatory had marked me and was circling just out of sight, waiting. When my shift finally ended at 7 that evening, I practically ran to my car in the hospital parking garage, my keys already in my hand, looking over my shoulder at shadows that seemed fuller than they should be. My apartment was in a modest building 20 minutes away, third floor walk up with thin walls and temperamental heating. But it was mine, and it was safe, and all I wanted was to lock the door and pretend last night had been a strange dream. Except when I unlocked my door and stepped inside, I knew immediately someone had been there. Nothing was disturbed, nothing taken, but the air felt different, and my skin prickled with awareness. I found it on my kitchen counter, a thick manila envelope that had not been there this morning, and my hands shook as I opened it. Cash. Stacks of $100 bills bound with paper bands, and when I counted with mounting horror, there was $5,000 sitting on my cheap laminate counter. The note was on heavy cardstock, just 3 words in bold black print. For your discretion. I wanted to scream. I wanted to call the police. Instead, I shoved the money back in the envelope and paced my tiny living room, feeling the walls close in. This was not gratitude. This was a leash, a reminder that he knew where I lived, could reach me whenever he wanted, and expected my silence in return. I was insulted and terrified in equal measure. That night, I barely slept, jumping at every sound, and when I left for my shift the next evening, I was exhausted and wired. I noticed the black SUV 3 blocks from my apartment, keeping pace 2 cars back, and my heart launched into my throat. I took a sudden right turn, then another, trying to shake them, my hands gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles went white. But the SUV stayed with me, smooth and patient, and I realized with sinking dread that I could not outrun them. I turned into a parking garage in desperation, spiraling up to the 4th level where it was nearly empty, thinking maybe I could hide. But when I parked and looked in my rearview mirror, the SUV was already there, blocking the exit ramp. The driver door opened and he stepped out, Blackwood himself. He moved toward my car with that same predatory grace, and I had 2 seconds to decide if I ran or faced him. I got out of my car, my legs unsteady, and met him halfway because I would not cower. He stopped 3 feet away, hands in the pockets of his charcoal suit, and told me his man was recovering well thanks to my skill. I said nothing, just stared at him, trying to control my breathing. He said he wanted to offer me a position, a retainer for his organization, excellent pay for occasional discreet medical services. I found my voice and told him no, told him I took an oath to treat everyone equally, but I would not be owned by anyone, especially not him. I expected anger, but he looked almost amused, his head tilting slightly as if I were a puzzle he was enjoying. He stepped closer, inside my personal space again, and I forced myself not to retreat. Up close in the dim garage lighting, I could see a scar on his neck just above his collar, tissue that looked like an old burn, and something about it tugged at the edges of my memory in a way that made me feel strange and unsteady. He told me quietly that I would reconsider, that I did not understand yet what he was offering or why, and he pulled a black business card from his pocket and pressed it into my hand. Then he stepped back, told me to drive safely, and returned to the SUV. I stood there shaking as they drove away, looking down at the card with just a phone number embossed in silver. No name. And I knew with sick certainty that this was not over. I spent the next morning searching for information on Alexander Blackwood and finding almost nothing, which terrified me more than if I had discovered pages of criminal history. There were a few mentions in business journals about property acquisitions and investments, always through shell companies, but no photographs, no social media presence, no digital footprint that a man his age should have. He was a ghost who moved enormous amounts of money and controlled God knows what, and I had refused him to his face. At the hospital that afternoon, my colleague Dr. Henry Crawford cornered me in the break room, his expression serious, asking if I was all right because he had heard about the incident in the ER 2 nights ago. I told him I was fine, that it was just another trauma case, but he shook his head and lowered his voice. He told me he recognized one of the men who brought the patient in, that everyone knew Blackwood's people, and that I needed to be very careful because people who get involved with that world do not get out. I insisted I had no intention of getting involved, that I had just done my job, but even as I said it, I could feel the weight of the business card in my pocket like it was burning through the fabric. Henry looked at me with something like pity and told me to be smart, to keep my head down, and then left me alone with my cold coffee and racing thoughts. My shift that night was supposed to be routine, post-operative checks and consults, nothing dramatic. But at 9, the ER doors crashed open again, and 3 men stormed in with guns clearly visible under their jackets. They were not Blackwood's men. These were rougher, wilder, eyes scanning the room with vicious intent, and they were shouting for a patient, a man named Luis Vargas who had testified against someone in their organization. The ER erupted into chaos, patients screaming, staff trying to calm people, security rushing forward, and I was frozen near the nurses' station trying to process what was happening. One of the gunmen spotted me in my white coat, and his eyes locked on mine with predatory focus. He crossed the distance in 3 strides and grabbed my arm hard enough to bruise, yanking me against him, and I felt the cold press of a gun barrel against my ribs. He shouted for everyone to back off or the doctor dies, and suddenly I was being dragged toward the exit, my feet stumbling, heart hammering so hard I thought I might pass out. Security stopped advancing, hands raised, and I could see the terror in my colleagues' faces as this man hauled me through the doors into the parking lot. Then everything exploded into violence. Blackwood's men appeared from seemingly nowhere, 5 of them moving with military precision, and the brief fight was brutal and efficient. The man holding me tried to use me as a shield, but another enormous man in a dark suit simply stepped between us and took the bullet that was meant for my chest, his body jerking with impact before he returned fire. I was shoved to the ground, my palms scraping concrete, and when I looked up, Blackwood himself was there, striding into the parking lot like an avenging angel, and his mere presence made the remaining attackers retreat to their vehicle and peel away. He was at my side instantly, hands on my arms pulling me up, then on my face, tilting my head, checking for injuries with a gentleness that seemed impossible from a man who had just orchestrated lethal force. His gray eyes were blazing with something that looked like fury and fear combined, and he asked me twice if I was hurt, his voice rough. I was shaking too hard to answer coherently, still in shock, and he pulled me against his chest for just a moment, one hand cupping the back of my head. Then he stepped back and told me with absolute finality that I was under his protection now, whether I wanted it or not, and this time I did not have the strength to argue. Blackwood insisted I come with him immediately, his hand firm on my lower back as he guided me toward the SUV, and I protested loudly, saying I had a job and a life and could not just disappear. He stopped and looked at me with those gray eyes gone hard and told me the hospital was not secure, that his rivals had just proven they could walk right in, and did I want to wait around for them to try again? I had no answer to that because my hands were still shaking, and I could taste fear metallic in my mouth. The drive through the city felt surreal, watching familiar streets pass by the tinted windows, while sitting next to a man who controlled an empire built on violence. And when we pulled into the underground garage of a glittering high-rise in the financial district, I realized how completely out of my depth I was. The penthouse occupied the entire top floor, all floor-to-ceiling windows and modern furniture that probably cost more than I made in a year, and the view of the city sprawling below was breathtaking and terrible. I stood in the middle of his living room feeling displaced and furious, telling him he had no right to just remove me from my life like I was a possession to be stored away. He poured amber liquid into 2 glasses at the bar, his movements controlled and precise, and told me his rivals now saw me as his weakness, someone important to him, and that made me a target. I asked him why he cared since we barely knew each other, my voice sharper than I intended, and he brought me the drink, pressing the glass into my hand. He did not answer directly, just said he protects what is his, and I bristled at the possessive language, telling him I was not his anything. He almost smiled at that, a slight curve of his mouth that made him look younger and more dangerous simultaneously. We stood there in tense silence, and then he told me he had been watching me for weeks before his man was shot, that he had seen me work, seen how I handled pressure, and treated people with respect regardless of who they were. I asked him if that was supposed to make me feel better, knowing I had been under surveillance, and he said no, but it was the truth, and he would not lie to me. I drank the whiskey in one burning swallow and demanded to know why he was really doing this, what he possibly owed me that was worth this level of protection. His expression shifted to something I could not read, something that looked almost like pain, and he said quietly that some debts cannot be repaid with money, some debts are carried in the soul. I did not understand what he meant, but the weight in his words made my chest tight. He showed me to a guest room that was larger than my entire apartment, told me to rest, that we would figure things out in the morning, and left me alone. I sat on the edge of the enormous bed feeling unmoored, my mind racing through everything that had happened, and I knew sleep would be impossible. Hours passed in restless anxiety until I finally got up and explored the penthouse, moving quietly through rooms filled with expensive art and cold perfection, until I found a door at the end of a hallway that was different from the others. It had a deadbolt lock, the only locked door I had encountered, and something about it pulled at my curiosity and my growing need to understand who this man really was. I had been crouched in front of the locked door for maybe 20 minutes, using a bent paperclip from the desk in my room and a hairpin, my hands surprisingly steady given how badly the rest of me was shaking with leftover adrenaline and fear, when I heard his voice behind me, low and dangerous in a way I had not heard before. He asked me what the hell I thought I was doing, and I startled so badly I dropped the paperclip, scrambling to my feet and turning to face him, finding Alexander standing at the end of the hallway with his jacket off and his sleeves rolled up, looking like he had just woken up, but also like he could kill someone without breaking a sweat. I lifted my chin and told him if I was going to be imprisoned here, I deserved to know who my captor really was, that he had stripped me of my autonomy and my life, and the least he could do was be honest about what he was hiding. His jaw clenched and he moved toward me with controlled fury, telling me I was not a prisoner and I was not entitled to every corner of his private life just because he was keeping me safe. I stepped forward to meet him, angry now myself, asking him what was so important behind that door that he needed a deadbolt, what secrets he was protecting, whether it was money or weapons or something worse. He told me to back off, his voice going cold, but I was beyond caring about his danger, beyond being intimidated, and I told him no, that I was done being kept in the dark by powerful men who thought they knew what was best for me. We were standing close now, both breathing hard, and he looked like his control was fraying at the edges, that perfect composure finally cracking. He made a frustrated sound and shrugged off his suit jacket completely, yanking at his tie and loosening his collar. And that was when I saw them fully for the first time. The scars were extensive, burn scars that covered the right side of his neck in mottled patterns of healed tissue, disappearing beneath his shirt collar and clearly continuing down his chest and back, the skin shiny and tight in places, textured and uneven. My breath caught audibly, and all my anger drained away in an instant, replaced by shock and something else, something that felt like recognition but that made no sense. I reached toward him without thinking, and he caught my wrist, not hard, but firm, and asked me with bitter coldness what I was doing, if I wanted a closer look at the monster. I shook my head and whispered, asking what happened to him, my voice coming out softer than I intended, and he released my wrist and turned partially away, telling me it was a long time ago and none of my concern. But looking at those scars triggered something deep in my memory, fragments of a nightmare I had been having since childhood, images that felt more like buried memories than dreams. fire licking up walls, smoke so thick I could not breathe, the sensation of being lifted by strong arms, a voice cutting through my terror telling me I would be safe, that he had me. I touched my own left shoulder blade unconsciously, feeling through my shirt the crescent-shaped birthmark that had always been there, that the doctors said I had been born with, and Alexander's eyes tracked the movement of my hand with laser focus. His entire body went still in a way that was different from before, not threatening, but arrested, and his expression shifted from anger to something that looked almost like shock or disbelief or hope, and he stared at my hand on my shoulder like he was seeing a ghost. Alexander asked me abruptly if I had any scars or marks, his voice rough and urgent in a way that made my pulse jump, and I stepped back reflexively, asking him why he wanted to know, what business it was of his. He moved toward me with an intensity that was completely different from before, not the controlled danger I had come to recognize, but something desperate and almost fragile. And he told me to trust him, his eyes searching mine with an expression I could not read. I hesitated because trust was not something I gave easily, and certainly not to a man who had upended my entire life in the span of days, but something in his face made me answer, made me admit hesitantly that I had a birthmark on my left shoulder blade, crescent-shaped, that I had been born with it according to every doctor who had ever seen it. The color drained from his face so completely he looked like he might pass out, and he asked me in a voice barely above a whisper what my birthday was, where I grew up, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. I told him May 17th, and that I did not really know where I grew up because I had been in foster care, that my earliest memory was waking up in a hospital at age 8 with burns on my arms and smoke inhalation, with no memory of my life before that day, no family who came looking for me, just fragments of nightmares about fire. He staggered slightly and sat down hard on the floor with his back against the wall. And I had never seen a man who commanded such power look so completely undone. He told me he saved a little girl from a warehouse fire 20 years ago, his voice shaking, that she had been trapped on the second floor, and he went back for her even though the building was coming down, and she had a crescent moon birthmark on her left shoulder blade. I felt the floor tilt beneath me and had to brace myself against the wall, my mind racing through impossible mathematics, and I heard myself asking him what happened to her, what happened after. He said he never knew, that he was arrested 2 days later for another crime and served 5 years. And when he got out, he tried to find her, but the records were sealed, adoptions and foster placements confidential, and he had looked for years before finally accepting he would never know if she was all right. I slid down the wall to sit across from him in that hallway, my legs unable to hold me anymore, and told him the doctors said I had been found outside a burning building, that someone had pulled me out and disappeared before the firefighters arrived, that I had always wondered who saved me. The air between us felt charged with something bigger than either of us could process, and he was staring at me like I was a ghost or a miracle. And I realized with a certainty that went bone deep that the man I had feared, the dangerous criminal who had taken control of my life, was the reason I was alive at all, was the person I had spent 20 years unconsciously searching for. The revelation changed everything between us in ways I could not have anticipated. The fear and tension that had characterized every interaction dissolving into something else entirely, something that felt like destiny or completion or coming home. I had so many questions, and Alexander, whose first name I now knew and whispered in my mind like a secret, seemed equally desperate to fill in the gaps of 20 years. He told me the full story sitting there on the hallway floor, his voice steady now, but his eyes never leaving mine, and I learned that he had been only 15 years old, a low-level runner for the organization doing whatever jobs they gave him to survive, on streets that had swallowed him when his mother died. The warehouse had been a trap set by a rival gang, and families of members were inside, including children, people who were supposed to be off-limits even in that brutal world. He said he got as many out as he could, carrying children and helping women through smoke and flames, but I had been trapped on the second floor behind a collapsed beam, and he heard me crying. He went back in even though the building was coming down around him, found me huddled in a corner barely conscious, and carried me out just as part of the structure gave way. He shielded my body with his own, and that was how he got the scars, taking burns that should have killed him so that I could live. I reached out without asking permission this time, and touched the scarred skin of his neck, tears streaming down my face, and told him thank you, the words feeling impossibly inadequate for the gift he had given me. He caught my hand against his neck, holding it there, and his eyes closed briefly, like my touch was something he had been waiting for. The moment stretched between us, and when he opened his eyes again, the air felt different, charged with recognition and connection and something deeper. He told me he thought about that little girl often over the years, especially in the beginning when he was locked up and had nothing but time to replay that night, wondering if she was all right, if she had family who loved her, if she even remembered. I told him through my tears that I became a doctor because someone saved me when I should have died, because I spent my whole childhood knowing that I owed my life to a stranger, and the only way to honor that was to save others. His expression transformed, a smile breaking across his face for the first time since I had met him. A real genuine smile that made him look younger and softer, and like the boy he must have been before the world hardened him. I saw past the dangerous crime lord to the 15-year-old kid who ran into a burning building again and again, and I understood that everything he had become was built on the foundation of that choice, the choice to save people, even at cost to himself. Over the next few days, I remained in Alexander's protection, but everything felt different now, the walls that had felt like a prison transforming into a sanctuary where we existed outside the normal rules of the world. We talked for hours, sitting in his study or on the balcony overlooking the city lights, and I learned about his life in ways I never expected he would share. The careful walls he maintained with everyone else crumbling when it was just the two of us. He told me how he rose through the organization after his release from prison, how he was smarter and more ruthless than the men above him, how he took control not through violence alone, but through strategy and an iron will that made even dangerous men fall in line. He explained his code, the lines he would not cross no matter the cost. No drugs because he had seen what they did to neighborhoods. No human trafficking because some evils could not be justified. No harm to innocents because that was the line that separated him from the men he killed. He controlled territory to keep worse men from claiming it, and while I challenged his rationalizations, asking him if control through fear was really better than chaos, I also saw the complexity, the impossible choices of a world I had never had to navigate. He asked about my life in return, about the foster homes and the loneliness of growing up without roots, about medical school and the grueling years of residency, about my work and why I pushed myself so hard, and I found myself opening up in ways I never had with anyone, admitting that I kept people at a distance because everyone I had ever loved had left. The attraction between us that had been simmering beneath everything else became undeniable, a pull I felt every time he looked at me, every time we sat close enough that I could feel the heat of his body. One night, after a particularly intense conversation about the warehouse fire and the guilt he still carried, he reached out and tucked my hair behind my ear, his fingers lingering against my cheek, and I leaned into his touch without thinking, my eyes closing at the gentleness of it. When I opened them, he was watching me with an expression that made my breath catch, hunger and tenderness and something deeper, but then he pulled back and told me I deserved better than a man like him, a man with blood on his hands and enemies at every turn. I told him he did not get to decide what I deserved, that I was a grown woman who could make her own choices, and I chose him, chose this, whatever this was becoming between us. He looked at me like I was something precious and breakable, and he was leaning toward me, his hand coming up to cup my face, when one of his men burst through the door with fear in his eyes and urgency in his voice, telling Alexander that the rivals had found the penthouse location, and we had minutes before an attack. Alexander's team mobilized instantly. The transformation from quiet evening to combat readiness happening in seconds, as men appeared from rooms I had not even known they occupied, each moving with practiced precision that spoke of training and experience I could only imagine. Alexander armed himself with a gun pulled from a safe behind a painting, the weapon looking natural in his hand in a way that should have frightened me, but instead made me grateful he knew how to use it. And he immediately ordered his men to get me to a secure location in the basement that I assumed was designed for exactly this scenario. I refused to leave him, and when he turned to argue, I stepped forward and told him I was a trauma surgeon, and if there was going to be shooting, then people were going to need me, that my skills were just as critical as his in a firefight. And he looked at me with fury and terror warring in his eyes. He was furious that I would not do what he said, but terrified for what might happen to me, and I could see him wanting to force the issue, to have his men carry me bodily to safety. But there was no time, because the attack came fast and brutal. The sound of shattering glass filling the penthouse as windows exploded inward from gunfire that turned the beautiful space into a war zone. I dropped to the floor as Alexander had taught me during one of our conversations about his world, staying low and moving behind the heavy leather sofa that would provide some cover, and I watched him transform into someone else entirely, moving with lethal efficiency as he fired back at the intruders, directing his men with hand signals and short commands while simultaneously protecting the area where I crouched. The noise was deafening, nothing like the sanitized violence of movies, just chaos and the acrid smell of gunpowder and my heart hammering so hard I thought it would break through my ribs. One of Alexander's men, a younger one I had seen around the penthouse named Marcus, went down hard near my position, clutching his side where blood bloomed dark against his shirt. And I did not think, just moved to him in a crouch and dragged him behind better cover while bullets chewed up the walls above us. I ripped open his shirt and found the wound, a through and through in his lower abdomen that was bleeding heavily, and I grabbed the first aid kit that Alexander kept mounted on the wall and began working, applying pressure and packing the wound with gauze while Marcus gritted his teeth and tried not to scream. My hands moved automatically, all my training taking over while my mind remained oddly calm in the center of the storm, and I was aware of Alexander fighting nearby, his presence a solid anchor even in the chaos. He glanced over once and saw me working on Marcus, and something in his expression shifted to what I could only describe as awe mixed with fear. Like he could not believe I was here doing this, but also could not bear that I was in danger. The attack seemed to last forever, and no time at all. And then suddenly it was over, the rival gang retreating under the coordinated defense, Alexander's men mounted, leaving broken glass and blood and the smell of violence behind. Alexander came to me immediately once the immediate threat was past, checking me for injuries with hands that trembled slightly, and I told him I was fine while continuing to work on Marcus, who would live if we got him proper care soon. The penthouse was compromised now, that much was clear, and Alexander made a decision I could see forming behind his eyes even before he spoke. He told me they were going to end this, that he was going to offer a meeting with the rival boss, Victor Redmond, to negotiate territory. But his tone told me it was not really a negotiation, it was a trap, a way to finish this war permanently. I felt ice flood my veins because I knew what that meant, knew he was planning to walk into danger that might kill him, and I wanted to scream at him not to do it, but the words stuck in my throat as I looked at his determined face and understood this was the only way he knew to keep me safe. I begged Alexander not to go into what was so obviously a trap, my voice rising with desperation as I grabbed his arm and tried to make him see reason, asking him how walking into a meeting with Victor Redmond could be anything but suicide when the man had just attacked us in our own supposed safe haven. He looked at me with those gray eyes that had become so familiar and told me quietly that this was the only way to keep me safe permanently, that as long as Redmond was alive and saw me as his weakness, the attacks would continue, and eventually one of them would succeed in taking me from him. I argued that there had to be another way, that we could disappear or bring in law enforcement or anything besides him walking into certain death. But he shook his head, and I saw the finality in his expression, the decision already made before we started this conversation. He stepped close to me and cupped my face in both hands, his thumbs brushing my cheekbones with a tenderness that made my throat tighten. And he told me that I had given him something he thought he had lost the day he went to prison as a boy, a reason to want to survive instead of just existing. The words broke something open inside me, and then he was kissing me, fierce and desperate and full of everything we had not said. And I kissed him back with all the fear and feeling pouring through me, my hands fisting in his shirt, as if I could hold him here through sheer force of will. When we broke apart, we were both breathing hard, and I could taste salt, and did not know if it was his tears or mine. He promised me he would come back, his forehead pressed against mine, and I told him he better because we had 20 years to make up for, and I was not going to let him escape me again now that I had found him. He kissed me once more, softer this time, almost reverent, and then he was pulling away and calling for Thornhill, his most trusted man, giving orders that I was to be taken to a different safe house and protected at all costs. Thornhill nodded grimly and put a hand on my shoulder, and I wanted to scream and fight and refuse to let Alexander go, but I also understood that my presence would only distract him when he needed every advantage to survive. So I let Thornhill lead me away while Alexander gathered his team, and I looked back once to see him checking his weapons with practiced efficiency, and then we were in an elevator going down, and I could not see him anymore. The waiting was agony, each minute stretching into something endless, as I sat in a sterile safe house, with Thornhill standing guard and 2 other men watching the exits. Hours crawled by, and I could not sit still, pacing the small living room and imagining every terrible possibility, seeing Alexander bleeding out in some abandoned building while Redmond stood over him triumphant. Thornhill tried to reassure me, but his face was too carefully blank, and I knew he was worried too. Then his phone rang, and I watched his expression shift to alarm as he answered, and I knew before he said anything that something had gone wrong. He told me Alexander had been shot but was alive, that they were bringing him to us now because a hospital was too risky with police involvement, and I felt everything inside me go cold and sharp and focused. When they carried him in 15 minutes later, he was pale and bleeding from a wound in his upper chest, his shirt soaked dark, and his breathing shallow, and I went into full doctor mode instantly, shoving aside the terror and the love and everything else that would compromise my ability to save him. I ordered Thornhill to clear the dining room table and bring me every medical supply they had while I cut away Alexander's shirt and assessed the damage, finding the entry wound below his clavicle and no exit wound, which meant the bullet was still inside him. I worked on him desperately, my hands steady even as my mind screamed, setting up a makeshift operating room and telling him he did not get to save me twice just to leave me now, demanding that he stay with me as I worked to stop the bleeding and extract the bullet that had lodged near his lung. I operated on Alexander for hours that felt like days, every second stretching into something endless as I worked to remove the bullet that had lodged dangerously close to his lung, my hands moving with steady precision, even as my mind screamed with terror at the possibility of losing him. The makeshift operating room was far from ideal, but I had worked in worse conditions during my residency in underfunded hospitals, and Thornhill had managed to procure surprising amounts of proper medical equipment that suggested this was not the first time Alexander's organization had needed emergency surgical facilities. And I talked to Alexander the entire time, even though he was unconscious, telling him he did not get to leave me now, that we had just found each other again after 20 years, and I refused to let him go, my voice steady, even as tears blurred my vision periodically and I had to blink them away to see clearly. The bullet had done significant damage, but had miraculously missed the major vessels, and I repaired what I could and irrigated the wound thoroughly and closed him up with careful sutures, my training taking over completely, while some other part of me stood apart and watched in numb horror. When I finally finished and confirmed his vitals were stable, I stripped off my bloody gloves and collapsed into the chair beside the bed where they had moved him, every ounce of adrenaline draining out of me at once and leaving me shaking and exhausted. I stayed by his side as he drifted in and out of consciousness over the next 2 days, monitoring his temperature for signs of infection and adjusting his IV fluids and pain medication, sleeping in snatches in the chair, because I could not bear to be more than a few feet away from him. Thornhill brought me food I barely tasted and offered to spell me so I could rest properly, but I refused, needing to be there when Alexander woke, needing to see his eyes open and know he was truly going to survive. When he finally woke fully on the morning of the third day, his eyes opening and focusing on my face with confusion that cleared into recognition, the first word out of his mouth was my name, rough and questioning, and I broke down completely. I told him through tears that he was an idiot for nearly getting himself killed, that I had just gotten him back and he had almost left me, and he reached up with his uninjured arm to touch my face with wonder, like he had not expected to wake up at all. He told me the trap had worked, that Victor Redman was dead, and his organization scattered, the war finally over, and I told him fiercely that I did not care about any of that the only thing that mattered was that he was alive. He said he could not lose me now that he had found me again, and I realized he was echoing my own thoughts, and I told him he would not lose me because I was not going anywhere. He reached for my hand and I took it, pressing it against my cheek and turning my face to kiss his palm. And he told me quietly that he had been alone his entire life, but with me he felt found, like all the years of isolation and violence had been leading to this moment. I climbed carefully into the bed beside him, mindful of his injuries and the IV line, and he shifted to make room for me and wrapped his good arm around me, holding me close, and I laid my head on his shoulder and felt his heartbeat strong and steady beneath my ear. We lay together in silence for a long time, and I realized with absolute certainty that I was falling in love with the man who had saved me twice, once from fire, and once by giving me a reason to believe in something beyond the sterile safety of my carefully controlled life. As Alexander recovered over the following week, his strength returning gradually as the wound began to heal and the danger of infection passed, I found myself making a decision that felt both terrifying and absolutely inevitable, the realization that I could not simply go back to my old life and pretend none of this had happened, that I had not been irrevocably changed by everything we had been through together. I sat beside his bed one afternoon while he was awake and alert, his color finally returning to normal, and I told him that I had been thinking about what came next, about how we could possibly move forward given the vast differences in our worlds. He watched me carefully with those gray eyes that had once seemed so cold, but now held warmth when they looked at me, and I explained that I could not be a bystander in his world, waiting safely on the sidelines while he dealt with danger, but I also could not pretend to be comfortable with everything his organization did. He listened without interrupting, as I proposed a compromise that had been forming in my mind during the long hours of watching over him, telling him that I would be the doctor for his people, providing medical care when hospitals were too risky or questions would be asked, but only for medical purposes with no involvement in the criminal activities themselves. I saw him start to speak, but I held up my hand and continued, saying that in return, I wanted him to fund a free clinic in the neighborhood where the warehouse fire had happened 20 years ago, a place where people who could not afford proper health care could come without questions or judgment or fear. His expression shifted to something like wonder, and he agreed immediately without hesitation, telling me he would give me whatever I wanted, anything at all. And I felt my heart clench at the generosity in his voice. I moved closer to the bed and took his hand, telling him quietly that what I wanted was him, all of him, the boy who had saved a frightened little girl and the man who had built an empire because he thought power was the only way to protect what mattered. I told him I wanted the parts of him he thought were too dark to show anyone, and the parts he had buried under years of violence and survival, and I watched his eyes grow suspiciously bright, as if no one had ever wanted all of him before, the good and the bad, and everything in between. He pulled me down to him carefully, mindful of his injuries, and told me in a rough voice that he loved me, that he had never said those words to another person in his entire life, but he needed me to know them now. I felt tears spill down my cheeks as I told him I loved him too, that somehow in the midst of all this chaos and danger, I had found the person I was meant to find. We kissed slowly and tenderly, sealing the agreement and the promise and the future we were choosing together, and for a moment everything felt perfect and possible. Then Thornhill knocked on the door with an apologetic expression, entering when Alexander called for him to come in, and the grim look on his face told me immediately that our moment of peace was over, before Thornhill even spoke the words that a detective named Catherine Blake had been investigating Alexander for years, and was finally closing in with enough evidence to move against him. Detective Catherine Blake arrived at the industrial property Alexander used for his legitimate import business 3 days after Thornhill delivered the warning. And I was there because I had been spending most of my time with Alexander as he continued to recover, unwilling to be separated from him, even for the mundane work of reviewing shipping manifests and meeting with business managers. Blake was exactly what I expected from Thornhill's description. A woman in her early 40s with sharp eyes that missed nothing and an air of absolute certainty that marked her as someone who had spent years building a case and believed she finally had what she needed to bring Alexander down. She presented the warrant to Thornhill at the door and swept into the office with 2 other officers, her gaze landing on Alexander behind his desk and then moving to me sitting in the chair across from him, and I saw the calculation in her expression as she assessed what my presence meant. She introduced herself formally and informed Alexander that she was investigating multiple crimes including racketeering, conspiracy to commit murder, and operating a criminal enterprise, and I felt my stomach drop even though we had known this was coming. Alexander remained perfectly calm, his expression neutral as he invited her to ask whatever questions she needed to ask, and I marveled at his control, even as my own heart raced with fear. Blake questioned him methodically about his businesses, his associates, the recent violence that had erupted between rival organizations, and Alexander answered carefully, admitting nothing, his responses measured and revealing only what was already public knowledge. She told him she knew about the gang war with Victor Redmond's organization, about the bodies that had turned up in the river and the burned-out buildings, and she said she would prove his involvement and bring him down if it was the last thing she did. I saw something flicker in Alexander's eyes at her intensity, a recognition of a worthy opponent, but he simply told her he looked forward to seeing her evidence since he was a legitimate businessman with no connection to criminal activity. Blake turned her attention to me then, asking who I was and what I was doing there, and I stood and identified myself as Dr. Eleanor Ashford, explaining that I had been providing medical consultation for Mr. Blackwood's employees regarding workplace safety and injury prevention. Blake's expression shifted to something like disappointment, mixed with contempt, as she asked how a respected surgeon from Metropolitan Hospital had ended up with a known crime lord, and I felt anger rise in my chest at the judgment in her voice. I met her eyes directly and told her I was exactly where I chose to be, that Alexander was a good man who had saved my life, and that she did not know him the way I did. Blake warned me quietly that loyalty to men like Alexander Blackwood ended badly, that women who believed they could change criminals or save them from themselves usually ended up destroyed, and I told her I appreciated her concern, but I was capable of making my own decisions. After Blake and her officers left with several boxes of documents they had seized under the warrant, Alexander turned to me with an expression of mingled gratitude and despair, telling me I could still walk away, that Blake's investigation would likely destroy my career even if he managed to avoid prison, that I deserved better than to be dragged down with him. I refused immediately, telling him I was all in, that we would face whatever came together, and I saw relief wash over his face, even as worry remained in his eyes. We spent the rest of that day planning carefully with Thornhill and Alexander's lawyer, a sharp woman named Michelle Reeves, who had been preparing for this possibility for months. Alexander began the process of legitimizing more of his operations, transferring ownership of questionable properties to trusted associates who could not be directly connected to him, creating legal businesses that would provide plausible sources of income and employment, and putting distance between himself and anything that could be proven criminal. It was a long game that would take months or even years, but I could see that my presence in his life was changing him fundamentally, making him want a future that did not involve looking over his shoulder constantly or waiting for the inevitable arrest that Blake represented. The months that followed Detective Blake's initial investigation passed in a strange rhythm of normalcy, punctuated by tension, and I found myself living in two worlds that somehow managed to coexist as the clinic I had envisioned finally opened in a renovated building just 3 blocks from where the warehouse fire had occurred 20 years ago. The space was beautiful in its functionality, state-of-the-art equipment funded through a series of anonymous donations that I knew came from Alexander even though he never took credit, and I split my time between my shifts at Metropolitan Hospital, hours at the clinic treating patients who came through the doors with ailments ranging from simple infections to untreated chronic conditions, and the evenings I spent in Alexander's world, observing as he carefully restructured his empire into something that could survive scrutiny. Detective Blake continued circling like a predator who knew her prey was close but could not quite pin down the killing strike, and twice more she appeared with warrants and questions. But Alexander's lawyer, Michelle Reeves, was always prepared, and the evidence Blake needed remained frustratingly out of reach. During those months, my relationship with Alexander deepened in ways I had never experienced with anyone. The intensity of how we had come together, giving way to something steadier but no less powerful as we learned each other's rhythms and habits and fears. He showed me one evening the locked room I had tried to break into all those months ago when I had first stayed in his penthouse, and when he opened the door, I found myself looking at filing cabinets and a desk covered in folders and photographs. He explained quietly as I moved into the room that these were files on every child who had been in the warehouse fire, 17 children total including me, and he had been tracking their lives for 20 years since he got out of prison. I opened folder after folder and saw school records and newspaper clippings, and notes in Alexander's handwriting detailing scholarships that had mysteriously appeared, job opportunities that had opened at crucial moments, legal troubles that had been quietly resolved. He had been protecting them from the shadows for 2 decades, ensuring they had opportunities and intervening when any of them were in danger. And I felt tears streaming down my face as I realized the depth of his guilt over that fire and the profound goodness that existed beneath all his careful control. I turned to him and told him he was not the monster he believed himself to be, that this proved he had been trying to atone and succeed and save people all along, and he pulled me into his arms with a desperation that told me he needed to hear those words more than I could possibly understand. One night in early autumn, as we sat together on the balcony of his penthouse, watching the city lights spread below us, Alexander reached into his pocket and pulled out a small box, opening it to reveal a ring with a single emerald surrounded by small diamonds. He told me it had belonged to his mother, the only good thing from his past, and he asked me to marry him with a vulnerability in his voice that made my heart ache. I said yes without hesitation, and he slid the ring onto my finger with hands that trembled slightly. But the next morning, just as I was leaving for my shift at the hospital, Thornhill called with urgency in his voice to tell me that Detective Blake had made her move, that Alexander was being arrested on charges of racketeering and conspiracy to commit murder, and I arrived at the property just in time to see him being led out in handcuffs while Blake read him his rights with grim satisfaction on her face. I fought for Alexander with everything I had, every ounce of strength and determination that had carried me through medical school and the brutal hours of residency, now channeled into saving him from a system that wanted to destroy him for crimes both real and imagined. I hired Michelle Reeves and her entire firm, leveraging every connection I had built in the medical community, and calling in favors from colleagues who owed me for covering shifts or consulting on difficult cases, and I liquidated my modest savings to contribute to his legal defense, even though he tried to refuse my money. The trial began 6 weeks after his arrest, and I sat in the courtroom every single day, watching Detective Blake present her case with the methodical precision of someone who had spent years building toward this moment. She brought forward financial records that showed suspicious transactions, testimony from informants who claimed to have witnessed Alexander ordering violence, and photographs of crime scenes that she argued were directly connected to his organization. When the prosecution rested, Michelle called me as a character witness, and I took the stand with my heart pounding but my voice steady as I testified about the clinic that had opened in the neighborhood where the warehouse fire had occurred, the legitimate businesses Alexander had built, and the man I knew who had saved my life twice, and who carried the scars of protecting others. Blake Cross examined me aggressively, suggesting I was blinded by romantic attachment to a criminal, and asking how a doctor could reconcile her oath to do no harm with involvement with someone who ordered killings. And I met her gaze and told her that Alexander had prevented more violence than he had caused, that he operated by a code that protected innocence, and that she did not know him the way I did. The evidence remained largely circumstantial. Financial patterns that could have alternate explanations and witness testimony from people with criminal records and questionable motivations. But I could see the jury struggling with the image of the dangerous crime lord Blake painted versus the man they saw sitting calmly at the defense table. Then, on the third week of trial, something unexpected happened. A woman named Sarah Chen took the stand as a defense witness, and she testified that Alexander Blackwood had saved her life 20 years ago when she was 7 years old, pulled her from a burning warehouse, and then quietly paid for her education through anonymous scholarships she had only recently traced back to him. One by one, 6 more people came forward over the next 2 days, all of them survivors of that fire now in their late 20s and early 30s. And they told the jury about the scholarships that had appeared when they needed them most, the job opportunities that had opened at crucial moments, the legal troubles that had been quietly resolved, and the man who had been watching over them for 2 decades asking nothing in return. I watched the jury's faces change as they heard testimony after testimony, and I saw them looking at Alexander with something like wonder as they realized the depth and consistency of his protection. Blake tried to argue that these acts of charity did not erase his crimes, but Michelle countered brilliantly that they revealed his character and his capacity for good. After 4 days of deliberation, the jury returned with verdicts of not guilty on most charges, and the remaining conspiracy charge resulted in a hung jury that the prosecutor agreed to plead down to time served and 3 years probation given the circumstances. When Alexander was released from custody that afternoon, I was waiting on the courthouse steps, and when he walked through the doors still wearing the suit he had worn to trial every day, he searched the crowd until his eyes found mine. He walked toward me, and I ran to him, and he caught me in his arms and held me so tightly I could barely breathe, his face buried in my hair as he whispered my name over and over like a prayer of gratitude.